There is a place where water flows beneath the soil, but none on the surface. A place where clouds gather with promises, but rarely weep. They call it Kalumbe, a small village tucked between the sun-baked borders of Burkina Faso and Niger. You won't find it on most maps, but for the people who live there, it is the center of the universe. Or at least it used to be, before the waiting began. It started in 2007. A girl named Nadia died. She was 6 years old. Her body failed after weeks of diarrhea from drinking muddy water collected in rusted oil drums. Her mother Mariama held her through the final night as the fever raged and her lips cracked like clay. When the dawn came, the sun rose, but Nadia did not. Her death was not the first, but it was the last straw. The people of Kalumbe gathered. No more funerals, no more waiting. They decided they would dig, with hands if they had to, and they did. For 2 months, men, women, even the elders took turns scraping earth. They shared stories between shifts' hands, blistered shirts soaked. They weren't engineers, they weren't donors, they were just tired of death. Then one day a white jeep arrived. It carried foreigners. Smiling faces, crisp shirts, branded clipboards. They spoke of solar purification, community resilience, sustainable water access. They promised a borehole, filters, and a tank. $500,000, they said. Fully funded. Just wait. So the villagers stopped digging, because help was coming. They built a sign that read, Kalumbe Water Project, in partnership with Global Living Trust. They painted it blue and yellow. They planted flowers around it. And then they waited. 1 year passed, then 2. The only thing that arrived was more paper. In the 3rd year, an email arrived. From an office over 8,000 kilometers away, air-conditioned, lined with espresso machines. Someone requested that Kalumbe revise their project description because it didn't follow standard French grammar. Mariama, Nadia's mother, had been chosen as the village project coordinator. She didn't speak French. She didn't even know what an email was. They asked the school teacher from the next village to rewrite the proposal, then walked it to the district capital for official stamps. Every stamp was another promise made on paper. We just want water, she said. You can't drink grammar. In the 4th year, a monitoring team arrived. They took photos, handed out tote bags, required the formation of a community fiduciary oversight board. A month later, a new set of regulations followed. All transactions must go through an international commercial bank. Every tank must display the donor's logo in color. The borehole would be named after the donor director's daughter, and most significantly, the land around the well had to be converted to public-private partnership status. They said it was to ensure maintenance. From that moment, the fields once used to plant millet became restricted land. No planting, no walking through, no entry without a project ID badge. In the 5th year, a bottled water facility appeared just kilometers from Kalumbe, using the same groundwater, but this time it had walls, gates, security guards. Villagers were not allowed in. You lack sanitation clearance, they were told. You need a certified health inspection. But isn't this our water, someone asked? The guard looked down at his badge and said nothing. The Kalumbe project sign began to rot. The flowers wilted. No one dared remove it. It belongs to the organization, they said. Children continued to fall sick from dirty water. Each year, more funerals. Nadia was no longer the only name whispered with regret. The cruelty wasn't that water never came. The cruelty was that hope had been escorted away inch by inch, smothered by forms, signatures, and restrictions. Kalumbe was no longer a village of diggers. It became a village pending approval. We began to argue not over differences, but over a dream that no longer belonged to us. By year 6, the school in Kalumbe had only 12 students left. Once filled with the hum of children reciting lessons, its benches were now hollow. The chalkboards cracked, the paint peeled. No more song, no more rhythm. The teacher, a man named Issaka, still arrived every day wearing the same worn-out sandals and the same patient smile, but the children, they had followed their older siblings to the city. Niamey, Bamako, Ouagadougou, places with names that sounded like electricity, like future. Places where you didn't have to carry water on your head for 2 hours. Places where maybe, just maybe, someone would see your CV and not your village. They left not in anger, but in quiet surrender. Even Mariama's son, Nadia's younger brother Ismail, left one morning with nothing but a plastic bag and his late sister's red scarf. He didn't say goodbye, he just walked. The elderly stayed. They sat on porches with eyes that had seen too much and hands too tired to plant. They watched the dust rise each evening and wondered what Kalumbe would become once their generation was gone. Some kept a candle lit every night, hoping the borehole might finally open. Others stopped asking. Issaka kept teaching. He wrote lessons on the board with no students to read them. He said even an empty room must hear truth sometimes. And then came the rains. But the rain didn't fall where they needed it. The clouds gathered, yes. The lightning roared, yes. But the land cracked deeper, thirstier. The people of Kalumbe began to speak in hushed tones, not about the drought, but about a different kind of famine, a famine of will. They had handed over the shovel, the pen, the right to decide, and in return, silence, more forms, a new set of compliance indicators, no water. One day a delegation came to assess project progress. They wore matching khaki vests with logos stitched proudly across their backs. They asked questions, then answered them themselves. They took drone footage. They handed out notebooks. But when Mariama pointed to the names of dead children carved into wood behind the church, they changed the subject. These things take time, one of them said, without meeting her eyes. Later that night, Mariama went home and found a bag left outside her hut. It was filled with t-shirts. On them a slogan, "Water is hope." She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. By year 8, the well was covered in weeds. The sign had collapsed. Termites lived in its wooden frame. Some children, those who still remained, used the area as a makeshift football field. At first the elders protested. "Not there," they said. "That's sacred ground." But the children didn't understand. To them it was just another abandoned place, a promise that meant nothing, a tombstone for a future that never arrived. One day the last living woman who had seen Kalumbe's first well, Mama Awa, passed away. No one knew how old she was. She had lost count after 70. She had also lost her voice years earlier, throat scarred by a lifetime of carrying buckets and grief. Her burial was simple. A cloth, a prayer, a silence so deep it swallowed the wind. Mariama stood beside the grave and whispered, "Forgive us." We stopped digging, and they stopped seeing us. That night, Issaka wrote 3 words on the school chalkboard. Before closing the doors for the final time, hope walked away. But not everyone walked. In the rubble and the stillness, in the memory of Nadia and Mama Awa, something flickered. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was something quieter, a question carried by a barefoot boy returning home from the city, with calloused hands, and a piece of broken pipe slung over his shoulder. Ismail. Ismail returned on a Tuesday morning. No one noticed at first. There was no trumpet, no procession, just dust on his feet and quiet fire in his eyes. He had grown. Gone was the boy who once cried beside his sister's grave. In his place stood a young man with rough hands, shoulders broadened by labor, and a resolve forged from city streets. He didn't bring back money. He brought something rarer, a decision. At dawn he walked to the old dried-up well, pulled the weeds, cleared the thorns, removed the termite-eaten sign, and placed a rusty pipe into the soil. No speeches, no permit, just metal and muscle. An old man passing by asked him, "What are you doing, boy?" Ismail answered without turning his head, "I'm digging." Again. By sunset, 4 children had joined him. One held a hoe, another carried a bucket. They didn't ask for instructions, they copied him. By the 3rd day, Mariama stood beside the hole, tears in her eyes. She didn't cry because of the effort. She cried because this time nobody was waiting for permission. They called it Nadia's Well. No donor, no email, no logo, just a name carved in wood, and beside it a pledge, water by us, for us. Soon people from nearby villages heard the sound of metal striking stone. They came not to offer advice, but to bring tools, shovels, ropes, even leftover parts from abandoned aid kits. One elder from a neighboring village said, "They gave us a manual on water safety, but no water, so he stayed to dig." Within a month, the hole was deeper than any foreign team had ever managed. Without blueprints, without budget approvals, they hit mud, then moisture, then on the 32nd morning, clear, sweet, glimmering water. They didn't shout, they knelt. One by one, the villagers dipped their hands in, like touching the sky through the ground. Then they drank. News spread faster than they expected. Colombe, once a forgotten dot between borders, became a name whispered across provinces. Not because of donor reports, not because of a viral video, but because of proof. The kind you can cup in your hands. Other villages came to see. They didn't bring cameras, they brought questions. How deep did you dig? What did you use to seal the walls? Can we copy this? Ismail didn't answer with pride. He answered with blueprints drawn by charcoal on old cardboard. He said, "Take it, improve it, make it yours." One visitor asked, "But aren't you afraid the big NGOs will come and shut it down?" Ismail shrugged. "Let them try. We already buried our fear. Now we drink from our own courage." Then something surprising happened. A retired engineer, once contracted by a global water initiative, returned to Kalumbe. He said he had spent decades designing projects that were never built. PowerPoints without pipelines. Now he wanted to teach. He started a workshop behind the school. Every Saturday, teenagers gathered with nails, pipes, and dreams. They called it the Redigging School. And perhaps the most beautiful change, Isaka reopened the classroom. This time it was full. Not with textbooks, but with tools. Not with curriculum, but with questions, real ones. How do we measure aquifer pressure? Can we purify using clay filters? What if we map underground streams ourselves? The same blackboard that once read, "Hope walked away," now bore 3 new words, "Hope came back." Colombe didn't become a city. It didn't become rich, but it became something rarer in the Sahel. It became free. Free from signatures written in glass towers. Free from conditional charity. Free from the lie that survival must be approved first. And when foreign officials returned clipboard in hand, they found only this message etched into stone. "We're busy building. Come back when you're ready to learn." Colombe did not change the world, but it changed itself. And sometimes that is more powerful. Because when you shift one village from dependency to dignity, you don't just alter geography, you alter memory. People begin to remember what it felt like to decide, to build, to matter. They begin to remember that before the aid, before the consultants, before the contracts, there were always hands. There was always soil, and there was always will. The world still runs on a lie that African people cannot rise without external help. That development must be delivered, never discovered. That the continent is a patient, not a planner, a receiver, not a creator. But Colombe dug a hole through that lie, and from it water came, and with it truth. Truth that our biggest problem is not lack of money, it is the theft of imagination. Truth that foreign aid is not free, it is a leash dressed in kindness. Truth that dependency is not destiny, it is design. And design can be broken. What Nadia's death began, Ismail's shovel completed. But this story is not about 2 people. It's about all of us. Because somewhere in Ghana, another child is waiting. Somewhere in Somalia, a farmer prays. Somewhere in Congo, an elder still believes. They are not statistics. They are not target populations. They are the architects of the future if we let them be. To every African youth reading this, you are not too young to dig. You are not too small to defy. You are not too late to begin. And to every elder, your memories are not burdens. They are blueprints. Pass them on. To our brothers and sisters in the diaspora, this is your fight too. Not because you owe it to your ancestors, but because you are your ancestors, and they did not survive chains and ships, just for us to beg again with open palms. No, we don't need another workshop, we need another well. The lesson of Kalumbe is simple: we don't wait, we build, we fail, we rebuild, we move. Because movement is the most radical act a people can make, after being told for centuries to stand still. So the next time a donor says, "We're here to help," ask them instead, "Will you follow?" Follow us to a new way of thinking, where charity bows to sovereignty, where funds come without conditions, where progress is measured in leaders, in laughter and freedom. To the world we say this: we are not your project, we are not your poster child, we are not waiting, we are walking, we are building, we are sovereign. Let every village that has been told wait, pick up the spade and say now. Let every school that was closed reopen as a workshop of invention. Let every well dug without permission become a monument of rebellion. Kalumbe is not alone. Kalumbe is a whisper turning into a roar. And if you listen carefully, you'll hear it spreading from Sahel to Savannah, from coast to capital. This is not just a story about water. It's about memory. It's about meaning. It's about the moment when a people say no more. No more signatures without power. No more plans without purpose. No more poverty packaged in promises. So now we ask you, do you believe in the new Africa, not the one in brochures, not the one in meetings, but the one being built by calloused hands, stubborn hearts, and quiet revolutions? If your answer is yes, then type it below, New Africa. Let the algorithm hear us. Let the silence break. Let the world know we are done waiting. The sun rose quietly over Kalumbe, as if mindful of the weight this village now carried. There were no drums, no parades. Just morning light falling softly on a place that had once been defined by absence and now pulsed with purpose. It wasn't just about water anymore. It was about what the water had awakened. With Nadia's well flowing, something else began to rise: confidence. Confidence not borrowed from brochures, but earned callus by callus, hour by hour. Women who once walked for hours to fetch water now stayed back to tend gardens. Fields that had been abandoned due to bureaucratic fencing were reclaimed not by protest but by quiet action. One morning, someone simply moved the fence post. No one said a word, but they followed. By the end of the week, millet seeds had returned to the soil that had missed them. Kalumbe had no mayor, no committee with official badges. What it had was a rhythm led not by hierarchy but by memory. People remembered how to share, how to barter, how to build without needing approval from distant strangers who'd never walked their roads. And slowly, stories began to travel. Not through the internet, Kalumbe still had no signal, but through word of mouth. In the markets of Dori and the bus stations of Niamey, people began to say, "Have you heard about the village that built its own well?" The myth of helplessness started to crack, and in its place, curiosity. A young girl named Aminata, just 10 years old, arrived with her uncle from a village 40 kilometers away. She carried a notebook filled with questions not assigned by any school, but written by hand after hearing whispers of Kalumbe's transformation. Her dream wasn't to become a doctor or a teacher. She wanted to become a water finder. She believed deeply that water could be taught like a language. And in Kalumbe, she found her classroom. Isaka welcomed her without fanfare. He gave her a stool, some scrap paper, and a question to begin with. Where does the water sleep before it wakes? They would sit for hours, not memorizing facts, but discovering them, digging through both soil and silence. For the first time in his life, Isaka saw education not as preparation for escape, but as a tool to plant deeper roots. Meanwhile, nearby villages began to organize water visits to Colombe. People came in groups not for charity, but for learning. They brought no project plans, no funding proposals. Just shovels, questions, and open hands. There were no gatekeepers, no entry fees. Just an open space beneath a baobab tree where villagers met every Saturday to share knowledge test designs and laugh over mistakes. They called it the circle. One day an elder named Samba shared a forgotten trick, how to track underground moisture by watching the flight patterns of certain birds. Another time, a boy barely taller than a spade invented a pulley using bicycle parts. Every week there was something new, not imported, discovered. Colombe was slowly becoming a seed bank not of crops, but of courage. But courage, too, invites confrontation. It wasn't long before a regional official arrived, sent to inspect the irregular activities. He came with a stern expression, accompanied by a driver and a clipboard. The village offered him water from Nadia's well. He refused. He walked around, asked rehearsed questions, and jotted down notes. When he finally gathered the villagers, he said, "This well is not approved. You are operating without authorization. There are protocols." Ismail stepped forward, calmly, not with defiance, but with clarity. "We didn't seek approval. We sought life, and we found it." The official warned of penalties, of shutdowns, of non-compliance. But the villagers didn't protest. They simply stood silently, men, women, children, hands, stained with soil, eyes steady with truth. In that silence, the official felt something he didn't expect: shame. He left without saying another word. Later, the children carved a new sign next to the well. It said, "We obey water," not warnings. That night, the stars seemed closer, the kind of night that reminded people they weren't small, they were surrounded. And not by threats, but by ancestors, by possibility. Colombe was not perfect. There were still days of drought, still illnesses, still hardship. But something irreversible had happened. The village had stopped asking to exist. They had remembered that dignity is not granted. It is exercised. And from that dignity, new rituals were born. On the last Sunday of every month, they held what they called remembrance digging, where even if there was no immediate need, they would gather to dig a symbolic hole, not for water, for memory, for the generations to come, so they would never forget that hands, when united, are more powerful than signatures. Hope had not just come back. Hope had taken root. Beyond the well and beyond the whispers, something deeper had started to shift in Colombe. It wasn't loud and it wasn't fast, but it was undeniable. The soil, once treated only as background to suffering, now felt like a co-author of rebirth. Each grain beneath their feet was no longer just dust. It was proof. Proof that the future didn't have to be shipped in crates or stamped by offices thousands of miles away. Ismail began rising earlier than usual, not just to dig, but to think. He had learned in the city how systems operate, how they count hours, measure outcomes, and label human lives with acronyms. But here, there were no reports to fill, no benchmarks to meet. Only the question that pulsed through every breath of Colombe now: what else can we reclaim? The answer came slowly. First, it was the abandoned tool shed behind the school, rusted hinges, broken doors, cobwebs thick as cloth. With the help of 3 teenagers and a hammer held together by twine, they restored it. They didn't call it a workshop. They called it a fixing place. In it, old tools found new purpose. Bent nails were straightened tin cans reshaped into scoops, broken buckets patched with cloth and resin. There was no manual, only intuition. Then came the revival of the storytelling nights. Before the aid meetings, before the missions, Colombe had gathered beneath the stars to share stories not for entertainment, but for survival. Stories that carried warnings, lessons, laughter. For years, silence had replaced them. But now, with the well flowing and the land singing again, the stories returned. Elders recounted times when wells were found by watching the ants. Children took turns imagining machines powered by wind and dreams. And amid them all, a new tale was growing of a village that chose to remember itself. Isaka began recording these evenings in notebooks, not for publishing, but for safeguarding. He called them the memory books, and each page became a rebellion against the forgetting that had nearly swallowed them. Meanwhile, in neighboring regions, something unusual was happening. Other villages, once silent under the weight of failed promises, began holding secret meetings. They met in schoolyards, in empty grain stores, beneath acacia trees. Not to complain, but to plan. Some sent scouts to Colombe. Others wrote letters not on official stationery, but on scrap cloth, on the backs of old packaging, on pages torn from calendars. "We heard your water speaks truth," one letter read. "Can we borrow its voice?" Ismail read each one aloud beneath the baobab tree. And then, without formality or permission, Colombe began sending teams not of experts, but of neighbors, with shovels, with rope, with stories. The village had become not a destination, but a starting point. They didn't call this movement anything. It had no brand, no logo, no anthem, but it spread faster than any development project had managed in decades. Children started carrying jars of Colombe water to nearby schools, not to show off, but to inspire. "If you can hold it," one boy said to his cousin in a village 2 days away, "then you know it can be done." The water was now more than hydration. It was heritage. But it wasn't long before opposition arrived. A convoy of tinted window SUVs rolled into Colombe one scorching afternoon. The delegation was led by a regional development authority, flanked by corporate representatives and security personnel. Their mission to assess the unauthorized expansion of unsanctioned infrastructure. They called it a compliance risk. The villagers called it life. A meeting was demanded. Chairs were set up in rows, microphones installed, and the outsiders began to speak. Charts, risks, policies, concerns about water safety standards, and environmental impact reports. Mariama stood at the back, arms folded. She had heard these words before. They came wrapped in kindness, but left with sovereignty. When they finished, she stepped forward. "We didn't ask for permission to bury our children," she said. "We won't ask for permission to save the next ones." Silence followed, and then applause. Not out of disrespect, but out of understanding, the kind that comes only when truth cuts through language. The officials packed up. They left without taking a single drop of water. Later that week, someone carved a new message near Nadia's well. "We pass inspection. Every time a child laughs." And then something even more unexpected happened. The rains returned. Not as a flood, not as a storm, but as a steady, respectful rhythm. The villagers said the sky was remembering them. Wells filled streams nudged awake, and the soil released its breath. It wasn't magic. It was timing. Nature had waited for the people to reclaim their rhythm first. With renewed energy, Colombe turned its eyes to other needs. What about power? What about connectivity? A group of young women led by a fierce teenager named Halimatu began tinkering with discarded solar panels. With the help of a retired electrician from a distant town, they rigged a lighting system that brought gentle bulbs to 4 homes, then 6, then 20. They named it Nadia Light, just enough for reading, for safety, for stories at night. No wires stolen, no permits filed, just illumination owned and earned. One morning, a journalist appeared. Sent by a major news agency, he wanted a quote, a photo, a story that fit in headlines. Ismail declined. "We're not your miracle," he said. "We're just what happens when you stop waiting." Still, the story spread, not through clicks, but through footsteps. Soon, villages that had never met began calling each other water siblings. They shared designs. They traded ideas. They reminded one another that dignity was not a zero-sum game, Colombe never got a monument. But one day, a little girl, visiting with her family, picked up a rock near the well and asked her mother, "Can I take this home?" Her mother smiled. "Why?" The girl held it tight and whispered, "Because it feels like truth." As the dust of the dry seasons settled once more, Colombe stood not as a miracle, but as a memory reclaimed. The village was still small, still poor in the eyes of many, but among those who lived there, something had changed permanently. Not in the soil, not in the sky, but in the spine. The posture of a people who no longer asked for recognition. Instead, they worked. Each morning you could hear the scrape of spades against earth, the clatter of tin tools passed from one hand to another. Not every project succeeded, not every idea bore fruit. But failure in Colombe was no longer a funeral. It was just another blueprint, adjusted, retried, improved. One of the quiet revolutions came from the women. They had long been the ones who bore the weight, literal and invisible, of water, of waiting, of grief. Now they were among the first to ask, "What about our voices?" They began gathering under a neem tree near the old schoolhouse, at first just for rest, to stretch tired backs. But slowly the conversations deepened. They shared ideas, debated, laughed, mourned, planned. From this space came the mother's map, a hand-drawn chart of Colombe, and its surroundings marked not by borders or roads, but by memories. "Here is where the first child died," one woman said. "Here is where we first danced after the well." The map grew. With it, so did the sense that history need not be written by others. It was theirs to draw. Isaka helped transcribe their memories into a growing village archive. He taught children how to record oral stories with handmade tools, not just to preserve the past, but to honor it as fuel for the future. The idea of archiving caught on. Villagers began collecting items: a broken bucket from the first, digging the original pipe used by Ismail, a torn shirt once worn by a child who fetched water for his grandmother. These were not relics. They were reminders. Reminders that waiting had once defined them, and that choosing not to wait had saved them. A shed was cleared and turned into a memory hut. It wasn't fancy, just clay walls and a tin roof, but inside hung the voices of a people once dismissed. A sign above the door read, "Not history, proof." And Colombe kept building, not up, but out. Children began taking their learnings to nearby hamlets. They taught others how to test soil for shallow aquifers. They shared clay filtration techniques hand-drawn in notebooks. One teenager, Faisal, built a wind-powered pulley from scratch and presented it at a gathering beneath the baobab tree. When asked where he had learned it, he simply said, "Watching the wind." Meanwhile, elders who had once sat in silence now taught workshops on old techniques, forgotten planting rhythms, medicinal root signs in the stars. These teachings had been dismissed by modern projects. But in Colombe, they were sacred again. Soon villages formed a network, not officially. No documents, no logos, just a web of people exchanging what they knew. They called it the quiet roads, paths of cooperation that needed no permission, no overseers. It wasn't long before whispers of resistance reached places of power. A foreign consultant sent by a multinational development bank visited Colombe under the pretext of evaluation. He wore mirrored sunglasses and carried a device that translated his words into multiple languages. But when asked to remove his shoes before entering the memory hut, he refused. He claimed neutrality. "We are here to help," he said. A child nearby replied, "Then sit." He did not sit. He left. Days later, a letter arrived from a government office requesting that Colombe cease unauthorized educational outreach. It claimed the workshops encouraged anti-institutional sentiment. The villagers didn't hold a protest. They wrote no rebuttal. Instead, they built another hut, this one for learning to read legal language. The sign outside read, "We do not fear paper. We write it too." One of the most beautiful moments came unexpectedly. A delegation of youths from Sierra Leone on a cross-continental journey to learn from community movements arrived with tired feet and wide eyes. They sat with the women, played football with the children, and spent hours at the well just watching how people moved. On their last night, one of them stood up and asked, "Do you think this can happen elsewhere?" Mariama smiled. "It already has," she said. "It just doesn't always have a name." And so Kalumbe began to mean more than a village. It became a verb. To Kalumbe meant to act before being asked, to dig before approval, to move before the map. The word appeared in distant graffiti, in late-night conversations between frustrated community leaders, in WhatsApp groups where activists shared voice notes across unstable networks. Kalumbe was now not just a place, but a rhythm, a whisper that kept multiplying. The world, of course, kept spinning. Bureaucracies still drafted reports. Global conferences still spoke of innovation without listening. Aid flowed and much of it evaporated, but something fundamental had shifted. Because Kalumbe had not sought to change the world, it had dared to change its corner. And in doing so, it reminded others of a radical truth, that freedom isn't always loud. Sometimes it is the quiet sound of shovels returning to soil, and the soft murmur of people saying together, "Let's begin."